The reason they had come to Iraq to fight was because of the torture and abuse of detainees at both Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay.
The caliphate would continue to exist, and it would be brought under control by the Saudis, who would fund it and recognize it.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 25 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. I'll start with the Senate report on torture. It's been in the works for 7 years. Neither the Bush nor Obama administrations wanted it to be published. But now the summary is out, and we know a bit about what's inside it. The big reason for the delay was supposedly the fear that if the facts got out, there might be riots at U.S. bases in the countries where American soldiers were stationed, putting their lives at peril. Well, the summary is out, and there hasn't been a single riot. It's pretty obvious why. Because the people in the countries that we've invaded and occupied know all about the torture. Maybe not every single detail, but they know what they've heard from their sons and their husbands, people who have been thrown in jail and grievously treated. Who doesn't know about this? Well, it's the American people who don't know. The American people who have been deceived, lied, left in the dark purposely, who've been fed propaganda about our noble missions and what our soldiers and CIA agents are doing overseas. It's the 1% and their bought politicians who want to keep us in ignorance. The report mentions that the intelligence gained by the torture was worthless, that it never got anything of value, it never saved any soldiers' lives. Missing, however, is the fact that the torture cost the lives of U.S. soldiers because it was the best recruiting tool Al-Qaeda ever had. You don't have to believe me. Listen to the words of Matthew Alexander, a former top U.S. interrogator in Iraq.
When I was in Iraq, I oversaw the interrogations of foreign fighters. And those foreign fighters, the majority of them said time and time again, the reason they had come to Iraq to fight was because of the torture and abuse of detainees at both Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. And this is not my opinion. The Department of Defense tracked these statistics, and they were briefed every interrogator who arrived there that torture and abuse was Al-Qaeda's #1 recruiting tool. And remember, these foreign fighters that came to Iraq, they made up 90% of suicide bombers. They killed hundreds, if not thousands, of American soldiers. And so this policy of torture and abuse did not make America safer. What it did was it caused the deaths of hundreds or thousands of American soldiers who are now buried at Arlington National Cemetery. So this policy has been counterproductive in so many ways. And one thing you'll never hear the torture supporters talk about, Amy, is the long-term negative consequences of torture. They won't talk about the fact that Al-Qaeda uses it to recruit. They won't talk about the fact that future Americans are going to be subjected to the same techniques by future enemies using our own actions as justification. They're not going to talk about the fact that it makes detainees more resistant to interrogations as soon as they walk in the interrogation room because they see us all as torturers. So they're not going to talk about all these long-term negative consequences.
U.S. CIA torture ended up causing the deaths of our own troops. Can it be put any plainer than that? Now, the only part of the report that has been shown to the public is the summary. There are thousands of pages of details that the Obama administration is withholding because that's the way CIA head John Brennan wants it. John Brennan, the same man who is implicated with others in the CIA torture program. Every cruel detail must come out because according to an important poll, a majority of people in the U.S. approve of torture. I'm convinced it's because they don't know all the stomach-churning details. Former Senator Mike Gravel has an idea. He says a senator or member of Congress should just publish the whole torture report. Gravel did that decades ago with the Pentagon Papers, the internal government study that showed the record of lying of administrations about Vietnam. Gravel let it out to the public. So he now says a member of Congress should do the same with the Senate report on torture. By law, they can't be punished for doing that. And by the Constitution, they have a duty to do so. That's something for you to demand from your member of Congress. Speaking of punishment, the Obama administration continues to take the position that no American official should be punished for ordering the torture. He says, don't look back, look to the future. But if the torturers get away with it, you can be sure that enhanced interrogation will be back on the table in the near future. Obama's attitude is also against the law. Shahid Buttar of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee points out that the U.S. has signed treaties requiring it to put people on trial if there's a reasonable suspicion or evidence of torture. Buttar suggests Obama appoint a special prosecutor to get things going. I do need to make a correction here. There is an American official in prison on account of torture. Not because he took part in torture, because he opposed it. His name is John Kiriakou. Because he confirmed reports that the CIA was using torture, he underwent years of government harassment and legal charges. Finally, he copped the plea to avoid a trial that could have resulted in decades in prison and bankruptcy for his family. This is Kiriakou on Democracy Now! In 2011.
John Kiriakou, explain what it is that you were trying to expose. Explain what you were involved with. Talk about Abu Zubaydah, your involvement in the finding of him, and then the course you took, where your conscience took you.
Sure. In 2002, I was the chief of counterterrorism operations for the CIA in Pakistan. And my job was to try to locate al-Qaeda fighters or al-Qaeda leaders and capture them, to turn them over to the Justice Department and have them face trial. That was the original idea, not to have them sit in Cuba for the next decade. But we caught Abu Zubaydah. He was shot 3 times by Pakistani police as he was trying to escape from his safe house, and I was the first person to have custody of him, to sit with him. We spoke to each other extensively. I mean, talked about everything from September 11th to poetry that he had been writing, to his family, and then he was moved on to a secret prison after that. Once I got back to headquarters, I heard that he had been subject to harsh techniques, then euphemistically called enhanced interrogation techniques, and I was asked by one of the leaders in the CIA's counterterrorist center if I wanted to be trained in the use of these techniques. I told him that I had a moral problem with them, and I did not want to be involved. So fast forward to 2007. By then, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International had reported that al-Qaeda prisoners had been tortured, and ABC News called and said that they had information that I had tortured Abu Zubaydah. I said that was absolutely untrue. I was the only person who was kind to Abu Zubaydah, and I had never tortured anybody. So they asked me to go on their show and defend myself. I did that, and in the course of the interview, I said that not only was the CIA torturing prisoners, but that it was official U.S. government policy. This was not the result of some rogue CIA officer just beating up a prisoner every once in a while. This was official policy that went all the way up to the President of the United States.
And so what happened after that in 2007, once you gave this interview? Can you explain what happened to you and to your family?
Sure. Within 24 hours, the CIA filed what's called a crimes report against me with the Justice Department, saying that I had revealed classified information, which was the torture program, and asking for an investigation with an eye toward prosecuting me. The Justice Department decided at the time that I had not revealed classified information, that the information was already in the public domain, but immediately, within weeks, I was audited by the IRS. I've been audited by the IRS every single year since giving that interview in 2007. But a more important bit of fallout from that interview was that every time I would write an op-ed, every time I would give a television interview or give a speech at a university, the CIA would file a crimes report against me, accusing me of leaking additional classified information. Each time, the Justice Department determined that I did not leak any classified information. In fact, I would get those op-eds and those speeches cleared by the CIA's Publications Review Board in advance. Then the CIA started harassing my wife, who at the time was a senior CIA officer, particularly over an op-ed I had written. They accused her of leaking classified information to me for the purpose of writing the op-ed. Well, I said I had gotten the information in the op-ed from two UPI reports and from a South American Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, and they would back off. But this sort of became our life. We would be under FBI surveillance. She would be called into the CIA's Office of Security. I would have trouble getting a security clearance when I went to Capitol Hill. It just became this pattern of harassment.
So, John, why didn't you stop?
Because I think that torture is something that needs to be discussed. I said this in 2007. This is something that about which we should be having a national debate. And frankly, I have a First Amendment right to free speech. And, you know, writing an op-ed is not against the law. Giving a speech about the Arab Spring or about torture is not against the law. And I felt that I didn't want to be cowed. I didn't want to.
Eventually, Kiriakou pled guilty to one charge and received 30 months in prison. He's there now. There are petitions asking for the president to pardon him. A letter was sent by 19 ex-CIA agents asking that the sentence be waived. So far, these pleas are falling on deaf ears. When it comes to whistleblowers, the president doesn't look to the future. He locks whistleblowers up as soon as he can. Now, to raise our spirits, some time-lapse photography that shows tens of thousands of people marching in a New York street on December 13th to protest the unpunished killings of unarmed people at the hands of trigger-happy police. There is no sound in this 20-second video that compresses 90 minutes of marching. Marchers walked for 4 miles in the protest. Now some video of marchers from street level. The anti-war movement is at a low ebb. The president is expanding wars in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. But not much is going on in the streets. There was a forum to discuss this in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We'll have some selections. The major speaker was Elaine Hagopian, Professor Emerita of Sociology at Simmons College in Boston and a leading Arab-American activist. Here she gives some background about the rise of the Islamic State.
Now you have these Sunnis who are under a Shiite prime minister, and they were at first not opposed to Al-Qaeda, but the U.S. promises these Sunni tribes that they will get a slice of the government pie, that they will be a part of the new Iraq, and so they fought with the U.S. against Al-Qaeda. And they, after that was over, the Nouri al-Maliki government failed to follow through and include the Sunnis in any meaningful way. As a matter of fact, we know that they began to attack them, and in some cases the Sunnis accused them of ethnic cleansing. Now, what happened in this period from about 2007 up to the present is that the Al-Qaeda that was transforming into ISIS actually grew out of Al-Qaeda. They began to set themselves up, and they began to free some of the prisoners that the U.S. had taken. These were professional people, so they could have them as supporters. They also began to kill off as many of the Arab awakening leaders. That was what the movement was called that worked with the U.S. They began to kill off some of their leaders for having cooperated with the United States. And so so on the one hand, they were getting rid of future leaders that would oppose Al-Qaeda, and which transformed into ISIS. And on the other hand, they were freeing people that they felt they could rely on to become part of their own administration. ISIS, when it finally emerged from this, really caught a very corrupt Iraqi government off base. They caught them by surprise. They began to spread into areas of Iraq. They captured Mosul and Tikrit. As you know, when they began to spread, they captured a lot of American weapons. So they had a lot of tanks. They were also funded by Saudi nationals and or the Saudi government. They were funded. They also stole money. When they captured Mosul, they pumped oil on the black market. And so they had a lot of money. They had been organizing from the time of the Arab awakening, when it was finally stopped. And so they were rebuilding, first as Al-Qaeda and then as ISIS. And when that transformation and how many actually left Al-Qaeda, I don't know. But it is clear that ISIS grew out of Al-Qaeda. So they captured Mosul and Tikrit, and they control Anbar province. If we have the map up there, we can see that the Anbar province is adjacent to Syria, on the border with Syria.
This section is very illuminating. Hagopian talks about State Department advisor Joshua Landis, who's ready to accept a tamed Islamic State.
And I think Joshua is a consultant for the State Department, so whether he was speaking as the expert that he is on Syria, or he was speaking as part of State Department policy, he was on GPS, Zachariah's program one day, in which he talked about the solution would be that the area in the western area, north and south, would become Syria. It would have to have a different government than Assad, but it would become Syria. And the caliphate would continue to exist, and it would be brought under control by the Saudis, who would fund it and recognize it, and that would have this nice little, sectarian state in the middle, but it would now be under control. So I tend to think that's a kind of State Department thinking, and I'm always amazed at how they come up with these ideas as though people were actually behaving that way and were going to conform to it.
Hagopian was talking about an interview by an enthusiastic Fareed Zakaria, where Landis proposes to accept a sectarian Sunni state in Iraq and Syria, one that is made less extreme by Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Oh yes, moderate Saudi Arabia. When the Saudi princes chop off your head, they do it with gentle moderation. So some in the power elite are already willing to work with a toned-down Islamic State. I've been saying for a long time that the U.S. empire cannot be depended upon to fight ISIS or Al-Qaeda. The reason is it wants to have extremists in reserve to defend the interests of the 1%, as it did in times past in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now to the question of what we should be doing. Clashing ideas from Cole Harrison, Executive Director of the Massachusetts Peace Action, and Marilyn Levin of the United National Anti-War Coalition.
First, we have to stand on principle. We have to stand for democracy. We have to stand for national self-determination. We have to stand for international law. So we have to stand on principle against the whole framework that it's the U.S.'s task to sort the Middle East out. It's not democratic, it's against self-determination, and it's against international law. But that's a long-term, I guess you could call it sort of an ideological struggle to overturn American exceptionalism and build a constituency in the United States for a democratic approach to foreign policy. We talked about foreign policy for all in an attempt to articulate what that foreign policy would be like. In doing that, we have some allies who agree with us for different reasons. And I'm referring to, the realists, or at least some of the realists. I'm talking about Stephen Kinzer, Andrew Bacevich. People like this say, look, this interventionist strategy just isn't going to work. It never works. It always has blowback. So they're not reasoning from principle. They're reasoning from American interests, so-called, as they see it. But nevertheless, they're kind of consistently against this knee-jerk interventionism. So we have to work with them, but also distinguish from them. But both the peace and justice movement and these realists are trying to move away from an interventionist foreign policy.
This year, the drama of ISIS, an unknown group swarming through the Middle East and beheading Americans, was intensified by the bought media and scared more people. Even people in the peace movement got scared and feel threatened. There's a cartoon that was wonderful in the Globe the other day, and it says these people are watching the news and in bed, and they're cowering in their beds, and the guy, the husband, I guess, says, "So what new manufactured crisis is going to paralyze us with fear today?" And this is called Mourning in America. And I think that's very relevant. So part of this is American exceptionalism. We are civilized. We don't behead people. No, we blow them to smithereens with drones and rockets. We send countries back to the Dark Ages. We torture people by unspeakable means. We finance Israel's horrendous siege and genocidal destruction of Gaza. We are much better. What is hopeful today is that inevitably we see mass responses to the injustices and repression. It is inevitable. Look at the recent uprisings and campaigns just in the United States that have won some victories in the most recent period. We had the massive march on climate change in New York, the rise of the Students for Justice in Palestine and the Gaza protests, the movement for immigrant rights, the Occupy movement, movement for marriage equality, the $15 an hour campaign, and the election in Seattle of socialist candidate Kshama Sawant. These are things that are going on all over the country. We can't predict when they're going to happen, but we know that the conditions are such that they will happen. Of course, the most exciting thing, if you look out the window, it's the uprising initially over the non-indictment of the police murder in Ferguson, but it's now reawakening the new stage of the civil rights movement that says Black life matters. The struggle is not over desegregation and voting rights. Today it is tackling the systemic racism and oppression of Black people in the country. Police brutality and racial profiling, mass incarceration, poverty, etc., and building a new, young, fighting leadership independent from the major parties. They are making demands for what is needed. They are not asking people to call their congressional representatives and beg for support. Because of this, they are forcing the president to say something. Hillary Clinton spoke out, and other politicians have to come on the bandwagon and take minimal action. And where were these leaders over the time when thousands of other victims were being brutalized and even murdered by a militarized police force? They didn't open their mouths. These struggles, as I said, are inevitable because the conditions necessitate that people start fighting back. The corporate powers are well aware of this and preparing for it. It is not an accident that the police force has been militarized, that the NSA spies on all of us, especially the dissidents, and potential leaders of struggles that we see now and coming, and that the Patriot Act and many other laws and orders to stifle opposition have been laid in place. Our role is to do the same that the people who are fighting in the streets today are doing. Almost done. Okay. We cannot rely on Congress or the UN, which the U.S. and other major powers use to do their bidding when convenient and ignore it when it is not, to join with every social movement in the streets in mass protest and to connect the issues to their source, the imperialist drive for expanding profit and dominance. We need to stay in the streets and make demands for what we want and do not want. We don't need to tell them what percentage of their budget should go for this, that, or the other. None of it is acceptable. The war budget is not acceptable. This rotten system needs to be brought down and replaced by one that meets the needs of the majority of the world and the planet itself.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.